Hello, I'm Simon and welcome to my channel Addicted to Code. This is the third instalment of my course Quasar DevOps, and in this video we'll set up the database server by installing Docker and getting MySQL and adminer up and running in a Docker container. Before we start, a quick reminder that if you like this video, please click the like button, and if you like what I do, please click the subscribe button and hit the bell. You'll be the first to know of new videos and courses that I release. Docker brings us a number of benefits over installing applications directly on the server. It provides clean and simple installs. You don't get hundreds of files polluting your server. You can run different versions of the same application in different containers. Trying to do that with an application like MySQL is a nightmare, but with Docker you don't even have to think about it. Using tools that come with Docker like Docker Swarm, you can start up multiple instances of the same container, allowing Docker to load balance your application and provide redundancy. The same container can be run on different operating systems. This is great, especially for development, where developers may be on different operating systems and you want them to run an application on their local machines, but in the same environment as it will be when it runs in production. And Docker is different to traditional virtual machines, which run a full operating system and require a certain amount of the host system's resources, even before you install and run any applications. Let me see if I can demonstrate the difference between Docker and a virtual server. A virtual server is a full operating system which requires something called a hypervisor to be installed on the host operating system. The hypervisor creates virtual hardware that can be used by the virtual servers it's running. Each virtual server is requiring almost as much resources as the host system, and we don't get any of the other benefits of Docker. For instance, each application has to be installed in full on the virtual server, so reusing the previous example, you can't run multiple versions of MySQL on the same virtual server. The Docker engine, on the other hand, requires little to no system resources, and what it does use is shared amongst all the containers running on the host system, so adding another container does not increase the use of the host system's resources other than that required by the application running in the container. In a moment we'll log into our database server, and this is what we're looking to achieve. We'll install Docker, which is a simple process, and we'll need two containers, MySQL and adminer. We'll also install another Docker related tool called Docker Compose, and this allows us to write scripts that describe the application stack that we want to build and how those applications should talk to each other on Docker's internal network. And we'll run the script we write with a simple terminal command. Docker will then connect to Docker Hub and download the MySQL image and the adminer image before starting up both containers and making the applications available as though they were installed locally on the database server. So let's get on and get the database server configured. We'll use SSH to log into the server. Now we're going to need to know the IP address of the database server. You can get that from the Hetzner control panel. Just click the IP address and it will copy it. So we want to log in as the root user. Paste the IP address in, and we need to specify the SSH key that we created earlier on. Now that's in my home folder in the .ssh folder, and we call it Quasar DevOps. The system asks us to authenticate, also to accept that we're happy with the authenticity of the host because we've never connected to it before. So we'll say yes, and I added a password to my SSH key, so I'm being asked for that. If you just hit enter when it asks you for a password when you did the generation of a key, you'll just come straight into the root prompt without being asked for a password. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is make sure that the system is up to date and fully upgraded. So we'll use apt update and apt upgrade. Once this is done, we'll install Docker. So apt install docker.io. That's all it is for Docker. So that's easy enough. You can check what version of Docker you've got and to make sure it was installed correctly with docker --version I'm on 18.09.7. Next thing we want to do is to start Docker, but also make sure that it's enabled so that it starts every time the system restarts. So we can do that with systemctl start Docker. That will start Docker now, and then systemctl enable Docker, which will make sure that it always starts when the system boots. Next thing to do is install Docker Compose. Now you can come to my website to get the files, because Docker Compose isn't installed with Docker. It's separate, and we download it using curl, and then we chmod the file to make it executable, and we create a symbolic link. And this source, I'm going to delete that. We don't actually need to do that final step. So it's just going to be these three commands here. So we can copy those and just paste them in. Downloads Docker Compose, chmods it, create the symbolic link finally. Next we want to create our Docker Compose file and to start up MariaDB and Adminer containers on Docker. So to do that we need to create a Docker Compose file, but rather than just putting it straight into the home directory, I'm going to create a directory called Docker, and then cd into there. And then we'll create a directory in MariaDB, and then nano docker compose.yaml. Now the file name docker-compose.yaml, it's not just something I made up. When we run Docker Compose, it will look in the folder that we're in for a file with that name. So again, from the website you can just copy this code. The link to the particular code for this tutorial is in the description, by the way. So if we copy that and paste that in. Now what we need to make sure here is that the IP address in the code here matches the IP address of the database server on Hetzner. Now when I originally wrote the tutorial online for this, it was a different internal IP address. So what we need to do is come to the Networks tab, go into the Quasar DevOps network, and we're looking for the database server. And we see the internal IP address for that is 10.0.0.3. So we can change that in these two places. So one for Adminer, change that 2 to a 3. Yours might be 2, so you might not need to change it. Okay, so I'm happy with that. So we'll Control O to write that out to file, and Control X to exit. Move this out of the way. And so finally now we can start up those two containers. Again, I just do ls-alh, you'll see we've got a Docker Compose file, so it's important that we run this command in the folder that has the Docker Compose.yaml file in there. So we're going to type Docker Compose. We want to bring up this particular Docker Compose file. And if we use the -d, that will run in detached mode. I'll show you without detached initially. What will happen is it will download all the files that are required. It will start running the installation. What you can actually see here is we're actually, because we've done it without the -d, we're in interactive mode as it were, so we're seeing the logs from inside the container. And the problem with this is that when we exit this terminal, we'll also exit the container. So MySQL and Adminer will stop running. So that's the reason why we need to run it in detached mode with the -d flag. So let me just Control C. If you just do Control C once, it will do a clean shutdown. and what we'll do is exactly the same as we did before. Docker compose up, this time put the -d on, and what you'll see now is that the two containers will start up and bring us back to a prompt, so they're now running in the background, and we can see them running by docker ps, and that shows us our MariaDB container and our adminer container. Okay, so what's next? Yeah, let's. I'm going to show you how we can connect into one of the containers so that we can run commands within the container. Because obviously these aren't running directly on the system; they're running within Docker. So, for instance, if we want to access the MySQL installation or the MariaDB installation, as we would in a traditional install, by installing it on the system, you would type the MySQL command. Well, in this case, that's not going to work because we don't have MySQL installed on the server, it's running in the container. So we have to connect to the container to run that command, and we'll do that with docker exec, execute a command, we use the flag -it, and then the name of the container. Now in this case it's MariaDB _db_1, so we can copy that, paste it in, and then we have to say what we want to run within the container. Well, there is a instance of the bash, so we want to get to a command prompt, so we're going to say I want to run bash in the bin folder in that container, and that will take us to a bash prompt. We're now in the container and we can now run commands such as MySQL, so we'll do MySQL -u for the user, and we want the root user, and we want to specify a password, and that password was specified, if you remember, in the Docker compose file. I maybe didn't point that out actually, but I'll show you when we've finished this. The password that is set up is example. We can change this later, and you can see we've now got a MariaDB prompt. And what I'm going to do is, for later on, I'm going to create a database. So standard MySQL command, create database, and we'll call this Q2B, Quasar 2 development, and remember the semicolon at the end, enter, and that's the database created. So we can do show databases, and you see there's our Q2D. So we exit, that takes us out of the MySQL, and we're back to the command prompt within the Docker container. Exit again, takes us back into the command prompt on the server itself. And I said I would just show you the container. So if we now know docker compose, you can see this is where this isn't specifying the password, it's saying that this is what the password is. That's already set up in MySQL within the container. So if we change the password for root, this is where we can change it inside the Docker compose file. We've also set up a volume. So by default, MySQL is saving all its files inside the container to varlib MySQL. Now to make it persistent, so for instance if we deleted the container, all that data would be gone. We don't want that to happen, so we set up a volume to say that we want to create a data folder, in this case in the same folder. That's what the dot is, that the Docker compose file is in, and we want to map all the files that are in this location inside the container to the data folder outside the container on the actual server. That'll give us the ability, if we wanted to be able to back them up. In the port section, we're saying we want to map 3306, which is a standard MySQL port running, that's what MySQL is running on in the container. We want to expose that outside the container. So we do 3306:3306. Now, the reason why I put the IP address in front, that's not necessary, but it's important. By default, Docker will change the IP tables to make 3306 available on all IP addresses on the system. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to configure a firewall with UFW. The problem is is that because Docker is making changes to IP tables, that will override the UFW commands that we put in. So what we're saying is here that we only want MySQL to listen on the internal IP address 10.0.0.3, because like we said in previous tutorials, we don't want Docker MySQL to be exposed to the internet. We want no direct connections to MySQL. We want everything to come through the web server, which will be the only publicly exposed server that we're running. So we just specify, like I say, 3306 should only be made available on this internal IP address. And we do exactly the same thing for adminer. In that case, though, it's port 8080, which is it's adminer is a web-based utility. We'll see that in a bit. But yeah, we're making sure again that it's only listening on that internal IP address. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is set up the firewalls, as I said, UFW. There's two things that we're going to need to know. One is, again, what the internal IP address is of our database server and our web server. In fact, more importantly, the web server. So in this case, it's 10.0.0.2. And we're also going to want to know the IP address that you are connecting to the internet with, so for your laptop, because we're going to prevent access to SSH to anyone other than your computer, or in this case my computer. Now you may not want to do this if you've got a change in IP address, i.e. every time you connect to the internet you get a different IP address, it's dynamic. Then this isn't something you want, it's something that you don't want to do. But if, like me, you've got a static IP address, then it makes perfect sense to do that. It just adds an extra layer of security. So the first command will be for SSH, so we'll say UFW allow from, and then I'm just going to check my IP address. And then we say to any port, or to any on port 22, and that's updated. I'll just clear that because I don't want my personal IP address appearing on YouTube. And secondly, what we're going to do is allow from. Remember, our Hetzner, the web server is 10.0.0.2, so we want to say allow from 10.0.0.2 to any on port 3306. So that will say that the web server is allowed to connect to MySQL. And finally, UFW allow from 10.0.0.2 to any on port 8080. So that will allow the web server to connect to adminer. And we'll set some defaults up now because we want to tell the firewall that the rules that we've set now should be the only rules that are allowed. So we're going to set some defaults. So we'll set default deny incoming. So basically saying that other than the rules we've already specified, everything else should be denied, which is coming into the server. And UFW default allow outgoing. So the default is that everything is allowed to go out. And finally, UFW enable, and we'll be prompted, are we happy to do that? Because if we've not allowed SSH, for instance, then at this point it would cut us off. So assuming that we've got everything right, I should stay connected, and we're still connected. So that is the firewall setup. We can check the status with UFW status, and we can see there's our three rules. if we wanted to, if you've made any mistakes and you want to delete any of those rules, then what you would do is UFW status numbered, and you'll see differences. It puts a number next to each of the rules. And then secondly, also if you want to delete the rule, you could say UFW delete and then the number that you want to delete. Okay, so that's our database server setup. I'll see you in the next video.